I came home from a 3-week construction job in Nevada to find a brand new pavilion sitting right in the middle of my machinery storage lot. And I knew immediately that the HOA had finally lost their minds. My name is Marcus Sullivan, and I own a small excavation and heavy machinery business in Scottsdale, Arizona. When I bought my property 5 years ago, it came with 2 parcels, the main house on one lot and an adjacent half-acre lot specifically zoned for commercial equipment storage. Everything was legal, documented, and approved by the city before I ever signed the papers. The HOA wasn't thrilled about it, but the previous owner had grandfathered rights, and those transferred to me. I had all the paperwork, all the permits, everything buttoned up tight because I knew how these neighborhood associations could be. But standing there in my driveway, looking at this ridiculous white pavilion with its decorative columns and red Spanish tile roof, I felt my blood pressure spike. My bulldozer, excavator, and 2 skid steers were nowhere to be seen. Someone had moved 50 tons of equipment and built a structure without my permission on property I owned. I walked over to the pavilion, my work boots crunching on the gravel that used to mark the boundaries of my parking area. There were even benches installed underneath, and a little sign that read Sunset Hills Community Gathering Space. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures, lots of them, from every angle. The concrete foundation was fresh, probably poured within the last week. They hadn't wasted any time. My phone rang before I could finish documenting everything. It was my neighbor, Pete, who lived 3 houses down. "Marcus, you back in town?" he asked. "Yeah, just got here. You want to tell me what happened to my lot?" "Oh man, I was hoping I could catch you before you saw it. The HOA went nuts while you were gone. That new president, Carol, she's been on a rampage. Said your equipment was an eyesore and she was going to do something about it." "Carol who?" "Carol Vandenberg. She moved in about 8 months ago, got herself elected HOA president within 3 months. She's been making everyone's life hell, but what she did to your property is next level." I thanked Pete and hung up. Carol Vandenberg. Of course it was a Carol. In my experience, every nightmare HOA story involved either a Carol or a Karen, and apparently I'd gotten lucky enough to get the former. I walked back to my truck and drove over to the HOA president's house. Pete had pointed it out to me once. A large territorial-style home with an immaculate lawn that probably used enough water to sustain a small village. The front yard had those perfect geometric hedges that screamed, "I have too much time and too much money." I rang the doorbell and waited. A woman in her mid-40s answered, blonde hair styled in that aggressive soccer mom cut, wearing yoga pants and a tank top despite the fact that she clearly hadn't done any exercise today. Her expression went from curious to hostile the second she saw me. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "I'm Marcus Sullivan. I live 4 houses down. I just got back from a job site and found a pavilion on my property." "Oh, you mean the community gathering space?" "Yes, isn't it lovely? We just finished it last week." The neighborhood has really come together around the project. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice level. "You built it on my property, without my permission." Carol waved her hand dismissively. "The HOA owns all common areas. We had every right to beautify that space." "It's not a common area. It's a private lot. I own it. I have the deed." "Well, that can't be right. All the land in this neighborhood is part of the HOA. Not my machinery lot. It was specifically excluded from the HOA agreement. The previous owner made sure of that, and those rights transferred to me. I've got all the documentation." Carol's expression hardened. "I've reviewed all the HOA documents, and there's no mention of any special exceptions for your property." That lot is an eyesore, and frankly, your commercial equipment brings down everyone's property values. We did what we had to do to protect the community. Where's my equipment? It's been moved to a proper storage facility. You'll receive the bill for the moving and storage costs. They're holding it until the fees are paid. I felt my jaw clench. You had no authority to move my equipment. That's theft. That's community improvement. If you have a problem with it, you can bring it up at the next HOA meeting. We meet the first Tuesday of every month. I'm not waiting for a meeting. You're going to tell me where my equipment is right now, and you're going to remove that pavilion from my property. Carol smiled, and it was one of those smiles that made me want to turn around and walk away before I said something I'd regret. Mr. Sullivan, I think you need to understand how things work in this neighborhood. The HOA has rules and everyone follows them. Your little construction business might work out in the desert somewhere, but here we have standards. The pavilion stays. Your equipment stays in storage. And if you don't like it, you can take it up with our lawyers. She closed the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, staring at the ornate metal numbers on her door. Then I pulled out my phone and called my attorney, David Richmond. I'd used him for all my business contracts and property purchases. If anyone could sort this out, he could. "Marcus, how's it going?" David answered on the second ring. "Not great. I need you to pull out all the documents from my property purchase, specifically the stuff about the machinery lot and the HOA exemption." What happened? I explained the situation while walking back to my truck. David listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. He was a good listener, which made him a good lawyer. "Okay, first thing tomorrow morning, I'm going to send a cease and desist letter to the HOA," he said when I finished. "They've overstepped their authority in a major way. Then we're going to file for an emergency injunction to get your equipment back and force them to remove the structure. But Marcus, this is going to take time. Even with an emergency motion, we're looking at weeks before we get in front of a judge. I don't have weeks. I've got 3 jobs lined up starting next Monday. I need my equipment." "I understand, but you can't take matters into your own hands. If you do anything to that pavilion, it could hurt our case. Let the legal system work." I thanked him and hung up, but I was already forming a different plan. The legal system was great and all, but I'd learned a long time ago that sometimes you had to solve your own problems. That evening, I did some digging. I called the moving company whose name Pete had managed to get for me. Turned out the HOA had hired a local outfit called Desert Transport and Storage. I called them up, identified myself as the equipment owner, and asked about my machinery. "Yeah, we've got your stuff," the dispatcher told me. "Lady from the HOA said you'd authorize the move." I didn't authorize anything. I was out of state on a job. There was a long pause. Oh man, that's not good. You want us to bring it back. How much is she charging for storage? $500 a day for equipment that size. I did the math in my head. Even if I got my equipment back tomorrow, I was looking at thousands of dollars for storage fees I'd never agreed to. Here's what I need. I'm coming down there tonight with my documentation proving ownership. Once you verify it, I want my equipment released to me. I'll pay whatever moving costs you're owed, but I'm not paying the storage fees. I'll have to check with my manager. You do that. I'll be there in an hour. I grabbed all my property documents, the original deeds, the city permits, and the HOA exemption paperwork. Then I drove to the storage facility on the east side of Scottsdale. The manager, a tired-looking guy in his 50s named Ron, reviewed my documents carefully. "This all looks legitimate," he said finally. "And honestly, something felt off about this whole thing from the start. The lady who hired us was super pushy, insisted we move everything within 24 hours. We had to pull guys off other jobs. I'll pay you for the move, like I said. Both ways, but I want everything back tonight. Ron nodded. Let me call in a crew. It'll take a few hours to load everything and transport it. Where exactly are you putting it? Right back where you picked it up from. He raised an eyebrow. What about that pavilion they built? What about it? Ron grinned. I like your style. Give us 3 hours. I grabbed dinner at a nearby diner while the crew assembled. By 10 o'clock that night, a convoy of flatbed trucks pulled up to my house. The neighborhood was quiet, most people already in bed or inside watching TV. The work lights on the trucks lit up the street like daytime. The first piece of equipment they unloaded was my Caterpillar D6 bulldozer. 16 tons of steel and power, capable of pushing pretty much anything out of its way. The driver used the ramps to back it off the flatbed and onto the street. Then came my Bobcat excavator, followed by the 2 skid steers. I signed off on all the paperwork and paid Ron his fee for both moves, plus a generous tip for his crew. They'd done good work on short notice. You want us to stick around? Ron asked, glancing at the pavilion that sat right where my equipment needed to go. No, I've got it from here. Thanks for everything. The trucks pulled away and I stood in the street looking at my equipment and then at the pavilion. The math was simple. My equipment needed to go back where it belonged. The pavilion was in the way. Something had to give, and it wasn't going to be my legally owned machinery. I climbed up into the bulldozer and fired up the engine. The diesel rumble echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Lights started coming on in nearby houses. I didn't care. I lowered the blade, put the dozer in gear and drove it straight toward the pavilion. The blade hit the decorative columns first. They were just cosmetic, hollow metal tubes wrapped in textured coating to look like stone. They crumpled like soda cans. The whole front section of the roof structure sagged, then collapsed. I kept pushing forward, the dozer's tracks chewing up the decorative concrete pavers they'd installed around the pavilion. The benches went next, crushed under the blade and pushed aside. I kept the pressure steady, methodical, reducing the pavilion to rubble and bent metal. The tile roof shattered into thousands of red pieces. The support beams, which weren't actually anchored properly to the foundation, toppled over like dominoes. Within 15 minutes, the pavilion was nothing but a pile of debris. I backed the dozer up, positioned it in its usual spot on the lot, and shut off the engine. Then I moved the excavator and both skid steers into their designated places. Everything was exactly where it belonged. By now, at least a dozen neighbors had come out to watch. I could see them standing in their yards and driveways, most in their pajamas or robes. Pete was there, shaking his head with a huge grin on his face. And then I saw Carol. She came running down the street in her bathrobe, her face purple with rage. "What have you done? What have you done?" "I moved my equipment back onto my property," I said calmly, climbing down from the dozer. "You destroyed the pavilion. You're going to pay for this. I'm calling the police." "Go ahead. While you're at it, you can explain to them how you had my equipment stolen and built an unauthorized structure on my private property." "This is HOA property." "No, it's not. I've got the deed right here if you want to see it." Carol was shaking, her phone already in her hand. "You're going to jail. You're going to lose everything. I'll make sure you never work in this state again." She dialed 911, and I waited patiently while she reported the destruction of property. The operator must have asked who owned the property, because Carol insisted multiple times that it was HOA land. Then she started describing me as dangerous and unstable, which made a few of the neighbors laugh. 2 Scottsdale police cruisers showed up about 20 minutes later. The officers got out and surveyed the scene. The pile of rubble, my equipment parked neatly on the lot. and Carol still ranting about destruction and vandalism. The older of the two officers, whose name tag read Martinez, held up his hand to quiet Carol down. "Madam, I need you to take a breath and explain what happened here. This man destroyed the community pavilion. He just drove his bulldozer through it. I want him arrested for vandalism and destruction of property." Officer Martinez turned to me. "Is that what happened, sir?" "That's accurate, but it's missing some context. The pavilion was built on my private property without my permission. The HOA also had my equipment moved to a storage facility while I was out of state working. I retrieved my equipment tonight and moved it back to where it belongs. The pavilion was in the way. You own this lot." "I do. I've got the deed, city permits, and all the documentation showing it's zoned for commercial equipment storage." I handed over my folder of documents. Officer Martinez reviewed them with his flashlight while Carol continued to protest. "Those documents are fake. The HOA owns all the land in this neighborhood." "Madam, please stop talking," Martinez said without looking up. He spent several minutes going through the paperwork, then turned to his partner. "Call this into city records, verify the property ownership and permits." The younger officer walked back to his cruiser. Martinez looked at Carol. "Do you have any documentation proving HOA ownership of this lot?" "I have the HOA charter and bylaws." "That's not what I asked. Do you have a deed or title for this specific parcel?" Carol's mouth opened and closed. "The HOA bylaws state that all property in the neighborhood falls under our jurisdiction." "That's different from ownership, madam. And even if the HOA had jurisdiction, which doesn't appear to be the case here, you can't move someone's property without their consent or a court order." "He's running a commercial business in a residential neighborhood, which he has permits for," Martinez said, holding up one of my documents. "City approved these 5 years ago. Everything looks legitimate." The other officer returned. "Dispatch confirmed it. Property is owned by Marcus Sullivan. Permits are current and valid. There's a specific exemption in the original neighborhood development that excludes this lot from HOA control." Martinez nodded and turned back to Carol. "Madam, it appears that you had a structure built on someone else's property without their permission. That's a serious issue. You also admitted to having his equipment moved, which could constitute theft or conversion of property." Carol's face went from red to white. "I was acting on behalf of the HOA. We were trying to improve the neighborhood. You can't improve someone else's property without their consent, regardless of your intentions. I strongly suggest you contact a lawyer." "What about him?" "He destroyed the pavilion. He removed an unauthorized structure from his own property. That's within his rights." Carol looked around at the gathered neighbors, probably hoping for support. Most of them looked away or suddenly became very interested in their feet. She'd been a tyrant since taking over the HOA, and I got the feeling not many people were eager to jump to her defense. "This isn't over," she said to me, her voice shaking. "The HOA will sue you for everything you have." "You're welcome to try," I said. "But you might want to check with a lawyer first about how liable you personally are for the HOA's actions. Because from where I'm standing, you authorized theft and trespassing." The officers took statements from both of us and several neighbors who'd witnessed the demolition. Then they left, and gradually everyone else went back to their homes. Pete came over and clapped me on the shoulder. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," he said. "Carol has been making everyone miserable for months. Last month she tried to fine me $300 because my grass was a 1/4 inch too long. She sounds like a real piece of work. You have no idea. She's tried to ban holiday decorations, pets in front yards, and any car parked on the street for more than 2 hours. Half the neighborhood is looking for ways to recall her as president." Well, maybe this will speed that process along. I spent the next hour cleaning up some of the larger pieces of debris and pushing them to the side of the lot. Tomorrow, I'd rent a dumpster and haul everything away properly. For now, I was exhausted and ready for bed. The next morning, I woke up to find a letter from the HOA's law firm taped to my front door. It demanded immediate payment of $15,000 for the destruction of the pavilion, plus another $8,000 for the equipment storage fees, and stated that failure to pay within 10 days would result in a lien being placed on my property. I called David immediately and read him the letter. "They're bluffing," he said. "They have no legal basis for any of those charges. I'll respond to their attorney and make it clear that if they pursue this, we'll countersue for theft, trespassing, and harassment. I'll also file a complaint with the state bar about their attorney sending threatening letters with no legal foundation. What are the chances they actually sue? Low. Once they talk to a competent attorney who explains how badly they've screwed up. But Carol sounds like she's got an ego problem, so she might push it further than common sense would dictate. And if she does, then we go to court and she loses. Badly. The HOA might even be liable for your legal fees and damages. But like I said, most likely this ends once cooler heads prevail. Over the next few days, I focused on getting ready for my upcoming jobs. I serviced all the equipment, made sure everything was in good working order, and lined up the crews I'd need. Word had spread through the neighborhood about what happened, and I started getting visits from other homeowners. Mrs. Patterson from 2 streets over came by with cookies, and a horror story about how Carol had threatened to fine her for having the wrong color mailbox. The Johnsons stopped by to tell me about the ridiculous restrictions Carol had tried to impose on their kids' play equipment. Even people I'd never met before came by to thank me for standing up to the HOA. Apparently, Carol had been abusing her power since day one, and everyone was too afraid or too tired to fight back. Seeing someone actually push back had emboldened them. On Thursday, I got a call from David with an update. I heard back from the HOA's attorney. Apparently, Carol never told him the full story. When he found out that the lot was actually your private property with all the proper documentation, he nearly had a stroke. He's advising the HOA board to drop all claims against you and to seriously consider removing Carol as president. Think they'll listen? The attorney made it pretty clear that continuing down this path could result in significant liability for the entire HOA, which means everyone's fees would have to go up to cover legal costs and damages. That tends to get people's attention. So it's over, not quite. I'd still recommend you file a formal complaint with the HOA board about Carol's actions, and we should document everything in case she tries anything else. But the immediate threat is gone. I thanked David and hung up, feeling like maybe I could finally relax. That feeling lasted about 3 hours, until Pete called me in a panic. "Marcus, Carol is going house to house trying to get signatures for an emergency special assessment. She's telling people they need to raise $25,000 to sue you, and that everyone who doesn't sign is betraying the neighborhood." Is anyone signing? A few people, but most are telling her to take a hike. The problem is she only needs 30% of homeowners to approve a special assessment, and there are always a few people who'll sign anything without reading it. I thought about it for a minute. Can you get me a list of the other board members? I think it's time I went over Carol's head. Pete sent me the contact information for the 4 other HOA board members. There was a treasurer named William Hopkins, a secretary named Jennifer Mills, and 2 at-large members, Robert Chen and Patricia Freeman. I called each of them and asked if they'd be willing to meet with me. All 4 agreed to come to my house that evening. When they arrived, I had coffee ready and all my documentation laid out on the dining room table. "I appreciate you all coming," I said once everyone was settled. "I wanted to give you the full story about what happened with the pavilion, and I wanted you to hear it from me directly instead of from Carol." I walked them through everything: the original property purchase, the exemption from HOA control, coming home to find the pavilion and my missing equipment, and finally moving everything back. I showed them all my permits, the deed, the city approvals, everything. William, a retired accountant in his 60s, shook his head while reviewing the documents. "Carol never brought any of this to the board. She told us you were storing equipment illegally and that the city had approved our pavilion construction." "Did the city approve it?" I asked. "Carol said she'd handled all the permits, but now I'm wondering if she actually did." Jennifer, who worked as a paralegal, pulled out her phone. "I can check with the city right now." She made a call and spent several minutes talking to someone in the planning department. When she hung up, her face was grim. No permits were ever filed for the pavilion. The city had no idea it was being built. "So she built an unpermitted structure on someone else's property," Robert said. "That's 2 major violations right there." "What's she saying about all this?" I asked. Patricia, a school principal with a no-nonsense demeanor, sighed. "She's telling everyone that you're a troublemaker who's trying to ruin the neighborhood. She's pushing hard for this special assessment to fund a lawsuit. She's also talking about banning commercial vehicles from the entire community, even though several homeowners have work trucks." "She's out of control," William said. "I'm going to be honest with you, Marcus. When Carol ran for HOA president, she seemed reasonable and organized. We thought she'd be good for the community. But in the past few months, she's become increasingly aggressive and hasn't been consulting the board on major decisions. This pavilion thing is the worst example, but there have been others." "Can the board remove her?" I asked. "Not directly," Jennifer said. "According to our bylaws, only the general membership can recall a board member, but the board can call for a vote of no confidence and an emergency election. Then I think you should do that, because Carol isn't going to stop. She's made this personal, and she's going to keep coming after me and anyone else who challenges her authority." The 4 board members looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations that happen between people who have worked together for a while. Finally, William nodded. "We'll call an emergency board meeting tomorrow and vote to request Carol's resignation. If she refuses, we'll start the recall process. But I want to warn you, Marcus. This is going to get ugly. Carol doesn't strike me as someone who goes quietly." He was right about that. The next day, the board met and formally requested Carol's resignation. She refused and sent an email to every homeowner in the neighborhood claiming that the board was trying to stage a coup because they were jealous of her leadership. She also started a social media group called Save Sunset Hills and filled it with claims that I was running an illegal business and that the board was corrupt. Most people saw through it, but Carol had enough supporters who either believed her story or had their own grudges against various neighbors. The community split into factions, and suddenly everywhere I went in the neighborhood, people were arguing about the HOA, the pavilion, and whether I should be allowed to store equipment on my property. David filed the formal recall petition with the HOA, which required signatures from 35% of homeowners to trigger a special election. Pete organized a group to go door to door collecting signatures. Within a week, we had more than enough to force the vote. Carol responded by filing a lawsuit against me personally for destruction of property, and another lawsuit against the board members for breach of fiduciary duty. Her attorney was a guy named Richard Temple who apparently specialized in aggressive litigation and didn't care much about whether his cases had any merit. Temple's a known quantity in the local legal community, David told me. He takes cases other attorneys won't touch and relies on bullying and intimidation. The good news is judges know his reputation, so they take his claims with a grain of salt. The bad news is he's going to make this as painful as possible and run up everyone's legal bills. How much is this going to cost me? Hard to say. Could be 20,000, could be 50. Depends on how far they push it. But Marcus, I'm confident we'll win. And when we do, we can seek compensation for your attorney fees. I'd built up a decent savings over the years, but the idea of dropping 50 grand on legal fees was painful. Still, I wasn't going to back down. This was my property, my business, and my livelihood. The recall election was scheduled for 3 weeks out. In the meantime, Carol continued her campaign of harassment. She filed complaints with the city about my equipment, all of which were dismissed because my permits were in order. She reported me to the state contractors licensing board, claiming I was operating illegally. That complaint was also dismissed. She even tried to get the neighborhood's water utility to shut off my service, claiming I was using water for commercial purposes without the proper connection. Every claim was baseless, and every complaint was rejected, but each one required time and energy to fight. I started to understand how HOAs could make people's lives miserable even when they had no legal standing. The process itself was the punishment. The low point came when I got home from a job site to find that someone had spray-painted "criminal" across my garage door. I called the police and filed a report, but I knew it would be almost impossible to prove who did it. Carol was too smart to do it herself, but I had no doubt she'd inspired whoever did. Pete helped me clean off the paint and repaint the door. While we worked, he told me more about what was happening in the neighborhood. The recall vote is going to be close, he said. Carol's got maybe 30% of the neighborhood solidly on her side. Another 20% don't really care and probably won't vote. That leaves 50% split between people who support you and people who are undecided. What do the undecided people want? Mostly they just want the drama to end. They're tired of the fighting and the lawsuits. Some of them think you should just move your equipment somewhere else to keep the peace. It's my property. I'm not letting the HOA bully me off my own land. I know, and I support you. I'm just telling you what I'm hearing. The lawsuit crawled through the court system. David filed a motion to dismiss based on my property rights and the HOA's lack of standing. Temple opposed it with a 50-page brief that David described as creative fiction. The judge scheduled a hearing for 2 weeks after the recall election. In the meantime, I focused on my work. I had projects to complete, clients to satisfy, and a business to run. The HOA drama was exhausting, but I couldn't let it derail everything I'd built. The recall election fell on a Tuesday evening in late March. The voting took place at the neighborhood community center, and the turnout was massive. I'd never seen so many people engaged in HOA business. Usually, these meetings had maybe a dozen attendees. Tonight, there were over 200 people packed into the building. Carol had set up a table with flyers and signs opposing the recall. She'd even made T-shirts that said, "Protect our community," with a picture of the destroyed pavilion. Her supporters wore them and handed out literature claiming that removing her would leave the neighborhood vulnerable to commercial exploitation. Pete and the other board members had their own tables supporting the recall. Their materials focused on Carol's unauthorized actions, the illegal construction, and the waste of HOA funds on frivolous lawsuits. I stayed near the back, not wanting to become the center of attention. I'd already voted by absentee ballot, so I didn't need to stand in the long line. I just wanted to see how it turned out. The voting period lasted 2 hours. Then the ballots were counted by 3 neutral homeowners who'd volunteered to serve as election judges. Everyone waited in tense silence while they tallied the votes. It took almost 45 minutes. Finally, William took the microphone. "Thank you all for participating in tonight's special election. The results are as follows. Total eligible voters, 483. Total votes cast, 317. Votes needed to recall, 159. Votes in favor of recall, 204. Votes against recall, 113. Carol Vandenberg is hereby removed as HOA president effective immediately." The room erupted in applause and angry shouts. Carol stood at her table, her face frozen in shock. Then she grabbed the microphone from William. "This vote is illegitimate. It was rigged. I demand a recount." One of the election judges, a retired judge named Arthur Klein, took the microphone back. "Miss Vandenberg, I personally observed the entire counting process. The vote was conducted fairly and accurately. The results stand. You're all corrupt, every single one of you. I'll sue the HOA, the board, and everyone who voted against me." "Madam, you need to leave now," Arthur said firmly. "You're no longer a board member, and you're disrupting an official HOA meeting." Carol looked around, probably searching for support from her allies. A few of them looked uncomfortable, but none of them spoke up. Finally, she grabbed her things and stormed out of the community center. The door slammed behind her so hard that one of the flyers fell off the wall. William returned to the microphone. "Thank you, everyone. The board will meet tomorrow to elect an interim president and discuss next steps. This meeting is adjourned." People came up to congratulate me as I left. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner about Carol's behavior. Others thanked me for standing up to her when they hadn't been brave enough to do it themselves. It felt good to have the support, but I was mainly just relieved that the immediate threat was over. The next day, the HOA board met and elected William as interim president. His first official act was to instruct the HOA's attorney to drop all lawsuits against me and the other board members. The second was to send me a formal apology on behalf of the HOA and an offer to reimburse me for my legal expenses up to that point. I accepted the apology and the reimbursement. David submitted his invoice to the HOA, and they paid it within a week. I was still out of pocket for some costs, but it was manageable. I thought that would be the end of it. Carol was gone, the lawsuits were dropped, and the neighborhood could return to normal. But Carol had one more card to play. 2 weeks after her recall, I came home to find a building inspector at my property. He was taking measurements and photos of my equipment lot. "Can I help you?" I asked. "City building inspector. We received a complaint that this lot is being used for unpermitted commercial activity." "I have all my permits. Would you like to see them?" "Yes, please." I retrieved my file and showed him everything. He reviewed each document carefully, comparing them to what he was seeing on the lot. "Everything appears to be in order," he said finally. "Your permits are current, the usage matches what's approved, and the lot is properly zoned. I don't see any violations." "So we're good." "From my perspective, yes. But the person who filed the complaint also claimed that you've expanded your operation beyond what's permitted. They said you're now using the street and other areas for equipment storage." "That's not true. Everything stays on this lot unless it's actively being transported to a job site." "That's what I'm seeing. I'll file my report stating no violations were found." "But I'll be honest with you, Mr. Sullivan. Whoever filed this complaint is persistent. This is the 3rd complaint we've received about your property in the past month. Each one has been investigated and dismissed, but they keep coming. Let me guess. Carol Vandenberg. The inspector didn't confirm or deny, but his expression told me everything I needed to know. After he left, I called David again. Carol's still filing complaints with the city. How do we make her stop? We could seek a restraining order based on harassment, but that requires proving a pattern of behavior specifically intended to harm you. The complaints to the city might not be enough by themselves. What would be enough? Direct threats, stalking, repeated unwanted contact. Has she done any of that? Not directly. She's been smart about keeping some distance. Then our best option is to keep documenting everything and wait for her to slip up. In the meantime, just keep doing what you're doing. Make sure you're always in compliance with your permits, keep good records, and don't give her any ammunition. I followed his advice, but the harassment continued. Carol filed complaints with the EPA claiming I was storing hazardous materials. That triggered an inspection that found nothing wrong. She filed a complaint with OSHA alleging unsafe work conditions. Another investigation, another dismissal. She even contacted some of my clients and told them I was under investigation by multiple government agencies, which cost me 2 potential contracts. That last one crossed a line. Losing business because of false allegations was tortious interference, and David assured me we could sue for damages. But I was getting tired of the whole situation. Every day brought some new problem, some new complaint, some new hassle. I was spending more time dealing with Carol's vendetta than actually running my business. Then Pete called me with interesting news. Carol's been going around to all her former supporters asking for money to continue her legal fight against you. She's claiming that the HOA backstabbed her, and now she has to pay for her own attorney. Is anyone giving her money? A few people, but not as much as she needs. Word is she's gone through 3 different attorneys because she can't pay their bills. Temple dropped her after she bounced 2 checks. So she's running out of resources. Looks like it. But Marcus, desperate people do stupid things. You might want to be extra careful for a while. I took his warning seriously. I installed security cameras around my property, something I probably should have done years ago. I varied my routine so I wasn't predictable, and I made sure someone always knew where I was and what I was doing. The precautions turned out to be necessary. One night in early April, my security camera alert went off at 2 in the morning. I checked the app on my phone and saw someone walking around my equipment lot with what looked like spray paint cans. I called 911 and then pulled up the live feed to watch what was happening. The figure was wearing dark clothes and a hood, but something about the way they moved seemed familiar. They went from one piece of equipment to another, spray painting crude messages. Illegal. Remove this. And HOA property. The police arrived within 5 minutes, probably because the dispatcher recognized my address from all the previous reports. 2 officers approached the figure, who tried to run but tripped over some debris and fell. When the officers pulled back the hood, I wasn't surprised to see Carol's face. I went outside to talk to the officers while Carol sat handcuffed in the back of their cruiser. She claims she was trying to mark HOA property boundaries, Officer Martinez said. He was the same cop who'd responded to the Pavilion incident. But your security footage shows pretty clearly that she was vandalizing your equipment. Will she be charged? Criminal damage, trespassing, possibly malicious mischief, depending on how much damage there is. The detective will be in touch tomorrow to get your statement and review the footage. They took Carol away, and I spent the next hour cleaning spray paint off my machinery. Luckily, she'd only hit the metal surfaces, and the paint came off with mineral spirits without causing any permanent damage. The next morning, Detective Sarah Williams from the Scottsdale Police Department came by to take my statement. I showed her all the security footage from that night and previous incidents. I also provided her with documentation of all Carol's complaints and harassment over the past several months. This shows a clear pattern of escalating behavior, Detective Williams said. Combined with the vandalism and trespassing last night, we have a strong case. The prosecutor will likely offer her a plea deal, but if she refuses, this could go to trial. What kind of penalties are we looking at? For vandalism and trespassing, probably probation and restitution at a minimum. But given the pattern of harassment, the prosecutor might push for jail time. That'll depend on her record and whether she's willing to agree to a restraining order. Carol was arraigned the following week. David attended on my behalf and reported back that Carol had hired yet another attorney, a public defender this time since she apparently couldn't afford private counsel anymore. She pleaded not guilty and demanded a trial. Her attorney tried to argue that this was a civil dispute that had been criminalized, David told me. The judge wasn't buying it. He set bail at $5,000 and ordered her to stay at least 500 feet away from you and your property. Will she follow the order? If she doesn't, she goes to jail. Even Carol should be smart enough to understand that. The criminal case moved forward slowly. In the meantime, I filed a civil lawsuit against Carol for harassment, tortious interference with business relationships, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. David assured me that with all the documentation we had, it was a strong case. The criminal trial was scheduled for June. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Lisa Chen, contacted me several times to prepare testimony and review evidence. She seemed confident about the case. We have video evidence, documented complaints, witness statements, and physical evidence from the vandalism, she said. Unless something unexpected happens, this should be straightforward. The trial lasted 2 days. I testified about the history of conflict with Carol, the Pavilion incident, and the ongoing harassment. Pete and several other neighbors testified about Carol's aggressive behavior and abuse of her HOA authority. The security footage was played for the jury, showing Carol clearly vandalizing my equipment. Carol's defense attorney tried to argue that she'd been acting under extreme stress and that the dispute over the pavilion had caused her to have a mental breakdown. He presented letters from her doctor about anxiety and depression. He portrayed her as a concerned community member who'd taken things too far in her zeal to protect the neighborhood. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They found Carol guilty on all counts: criminal damage, trespassing, and malicious mischief. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. At the sentencing hearing, the prosecutor asked for jail time, arguing that Carol had shown no remorse and had continued her harassment right up until her arrest. Carol's attorney asked for probation and community service, citing her clean record before this incident and her mental health struggles. The judge, a stern woman named Margaret Cooper, reviewed all the evidence and statements before making her decision. Miss Vandenberg, you engaged in a sustained campaign of harassment against Mr. Sullivan simply because he exercised his legal property rights, Judge Cooper said. You abused your position of authority in the HOA, you filed false complaints with multiple government agencies, you interfered with his business, and you ultimately committed criminal acts on his property. This court takes these matters very seriously. She sentenced Carol to 6 months in jail, with all but 30 days suspended, meaning Carol would serve 30 days and then be on probation for 2 years. She also ordered Carol to pay restitution for all damage, court costs, and to stay away from me permanently. Any violation of the restraining order would result in her serving the remaining suspended sentence. Carol's face crumbled when she heard the sentence. Her attorney immediately filed a notice of appeal, but the sentence stood pending the appeal process. Carol was led away to begin serving her 30 days. The civil lawsuit settled a month later. Carol's insurance company agreed to pay $75,000 to cover my legal fees, lost business, and damages. Carol personally had to pay an additional $25,000 in punitive damages, which she arranged to pay in monthly installments over 5 years. By July, things had finally returned to normal. My equipment sat undisturbed on my lot. The HOA, under William's leadership, focused on actual community issues like street maintenance and landscaping instead of harassing residents. Several of the more ridiculous rules Carol had implemented were repealed. I ran into Pete at the grocery store one Saturday morning. "How's retirement from HOA drama treating you?" he asked with a grin. "Pretty good. I've actually been getting more work lately. I think people heard about what happened and figured anyone willing to stand up to an HOA like that must be pretty determined and reliable." "That's great. Hey, the board is talking about having a neighborhood barbecue next month, kind of a fresh start for the community. You should come." "I'll think about it. Still a little wary of community gatherings after everything that happened." "Fair enough. But for what it's worth, most people in the neighborhood think you're a hero. Carol made a lot of people miserable, and you were the first person to stand up to her." I appreciated the sentiment, but I didn't feel much like a hero. I'd just been defending my property and my business. The fact that it had required lawyers, police, and criminal trials was a sad commentary on how out of control HOAs could get. Carol served her 30 days in jail and was released in late August. I never saw her around the neighborhood after that. Pete told me she'd moved to Phoenix shortly after getting out, probably because she couldn't face living in Sunset Hills anymore. Her house went on the market in September and sold within a month. The new owners were a young couple with 2 kids. They knocked on my door the day after they moved in to introduce themselves. "We heard about what happened with the previous owner," the husband said. "We want you to know that we think what you did was completely justified." We actually specifically looked for a house in a neighborhood that didn't have a crazy HOA. And several people told us that Sunset Hills had cleaned house and was much better now. It was strange to think that my conflict with Carol had become a selling point for the neighborhood, but I was glad something positive had come from it. The civil appeal was eventually denied, and Carol's criminal conviction stood. The last I heard, she was working as a manager at a retail store in Phoenix and staying far away from any HOA positions. I hoped she'd learned something from the experience, though I had my doubts. As for me, I continued running my business from my legally permitted, properly documented equipment lot. The security cameras stayed up, and I kept meticulous records of everything, just in case. But the harassment stopped. No more midnight vandalism. No more false complaints. No more interference with my work. William served out the remainder of Carol's term as HOA president and then declined to run for re-election. The neighborhood elected a retired teacher named Barbara Morrison, who ran on a platform of common sense and minimal interference in residents' lives. The HOA returned to its intended purpose: maintaining common areas, organizing occasional community events, and handling legitimate issues when they arose. I even went to that neighborhood barbecue Pete had mentioned. It was actually pleasant. People were friendly, the food was good, and nobody tried to cite me for any violations. It felt like a real community instead of a battlefield. Looking back on the whole situation, I learned some important lessons. First, documentation is everything. If I hadn't kept every permit, every deed, every piece of paper related to my property, things could have turned out very differently. Second, some people will abuse whatever power they're given, and the only way to stop them is to stand up to them early and firmly. And third, most people are reasonable if you give them accurate information and treat them with respect. The Pavilion incident could have been resolved peacefully if Carol had just checked the property records before building on my lot. The harassment could have been avoided if she'd accepted that she'd made a mistake and moved on. But her ego and her need to control everything turned a simple property dispute into a criminal matter that destroyed her reputation and cost her financially. I sold my business 3 years later, but not because of HOA problems. I'd gotten an offer from a larger company that was too good to refuse, and I was ready for a change. The new owner kept the equipment lot, and as far as I know, they've never had any issues with the HOA. Before I moved away from Scottsdale, I had dinner with Pete and some of the other neighbors who'd supported me through everything. We laughed about the absurdity of the whole situation, the ridiculous complaints, the dramatic board meetings, and especially the night I'd bulldozed the Pavilion. "You know what the crazy thing is," Pete said. "The lot actually looks better with your equipment on it than it did with that tacky Pavilion. At least the equipment is honest about what it is." Everyone raised their glasses to that sentiment. We toasted to honest equipment, reasonable HOAs, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. I moved to Colorado shortly after that, to a property with 10 acres and no HOA. I bought a small cabin and spent my time consulting for construction companies and enjoying the peace and quiet. No neighbors complaining about what I parked on my land. No boards dictating what color I could paint my house. No Carols trying to build pavilions where they didn't belong. Sometimes I think about that night with the bulldozer, the satisfying crunch of those fake columns collapsing, the look on Carol's face when she realized she'd messed with the wrong person. It wasn't the most mature way to handle the situation, and if I had to do it over again, I might have waited for the legal system to work things out first. But probably not. Sometimes you need to take action, to draw a line in the sand and say, this far and no further. My equipment lot was that line. Carol crossed it, and she paid the price. The whole experience taught me that property rights matter, that documentation is crucial, and that communities work best when everyone respects each other's boundaries. It also taught me that HOAs can be helpful when run by reasonable people, but they can become tyrannical when power-hungry individuals take control. If I could give advice to anyone facing a similar situation, it would be this: know your rights, document everything, don't be afraid to stand up for yourself, but also know when to let the legal system do its job, and maybe invest in some good security cameras before things escalate. I never heard from Carol again after I left Arizona. I hope she found some peace and learned from her mistakes. But more than that, I hope the residents of Sunset Hills continued to enjoy their improved HOA and remembered that communities are built on mutual respect, not authoritarian control. As for me, I'm happy on my 10 acres in Colorado, far from any HOA jurisdiction. My equipment, what little I kept for personal projects, sits wherever I want it to sit. Nobody complains, nobody files false reports, and nobody builds unauthorized structures on my property. It's a good life, and I earned it by standing my ground when it mattered most. The Pavilion is long gone, reduced to rubble and hauled away to a landfill. But the principle remains. This is my property, and I'll defend it against anyone who thinks they have the right to take it from me, HOA president or not.